Hi, my name is Maritza, and thank you for clicking on this video about over-the-phone interpreting. But before we start, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about myself. I started this podcast about 30 days ago, and I didn't realize how terrified I am in front of the camera. So even though this video has a lot of information and will give you everything you've ever wanted to ask about over-the-phone interpreting, it's pretty boring. And it's funny because one of the reasons why I started this podcast is because whenever I needed information about interpreting, the videos that were available were very boring. And for some reason, guys, I cannot loosen up. I'm fun and friendly. I'm actually pretty goofy. I'm so goofy that the day before I filmed this video for the 5th time, trying to make it more friendly and trying to relax, and I just couldn't. But anyway, the day before I went to Oktoberfest here in my city, and I was singing really loud with the crowd with this awesome cover band, and yeah, I messed up my voice. So I am struggling in this video, trying to have a good voice, trying to be clear and trying to be friendly and trying to convey that I am somebody that can give you information that you need regarding interpreting, and I couldn't pull it off. So I apologize, but the information is actually pretty awesome. So I hope you stay till the very end. And I hope you watch the other videos. I have one on voice care, one on ASL, and of course I have the weekly terminology practices called Ring of Fire. So thank you for clicking. I hope you stay to the end, and I'm going to try to be more friendly and more relaxed, but it's taking me a while, so I hope you understand. Talk to you soon. If I asked you what is the most difficult type of interpreting, what would your answer be? Would it be conference interpreting, where interpreters are interpreting with other interpreters next to each other, interpreting for more than 1,000 people? Would you say it's medical interpreting, where an interpreter has to know medical terminology to be able to interpret between a patient and their medical provider? Or would you say it's legal interpreting, where an interpreter sits next to a judge and renders to an entire courtroom? If you ask me, I would say it's over-the-phone interpreting. In this episode, we'll talk about what is over-the-phone interpreting and how you can become an OPI, an over-the-phone interpreter. I believe that over-the-phone interpreting is the most difficult type of interpreting because the interpreter doesn't know what the conversation is going to be about when they receive a call. The call could be medical, banking, car insurance, medical insurance, appointments, therapy sessions, educational calls. It could be just about anything. Let's start with the invention of the telephone, where it all started. In the mid-1800s, inventors were thinking about creating some kind of a device where two people can speak to each other regardless on how far away they were. The telephone was invented in 1876 thanks to these gentlemen. By the 1930s, there were more than 220,000 switchboard operators. Despite the high use of the telephone, it wasn't until the 1950s that people started asking, what if I need to call someone that speaks another language? In 1973, the Australian government provided free over-the-phone interpreting for immigrants so that they could communicate with government agencies. But it wasn't until 1981 when the United States started using over-the-phone interpreting. 10 years later, the demand grew. Financial industry, telecommunications, healthcare, federal court systems, and public health systems needed to provide over-the-phone interpreting for their consumers. Today, in the 21st century, there are thousands of over-the-phone interpreters interpreting 24/7 in more than 220 languages. Like most things, there are advantages and disadvantages. One of the advantages of OPI is speed. A consumer picks up the phone and is immediately connected 24/7 with an interpreter. Another advantage is confidentiality and impartiality. It's great having an in-person interpreter, but sometimes the people speaking would rather be by themselves than having a third person in the room. An OPI can provide this type of setting. Not having an interpreter in the room makes it easier for the patient to speak to their medical professional, or for a defendant or plaintiff to speak to an attorney. A disadvantage, on the other hand, is not being in the room. When an interpreter is over the phone, they can't see what the situation is. They don't know how many people are in the room. Are they on speakerphone? Is the phone being passed back and forth? Or are they on a video call? Another disadvantage is the consecutive mode. All OPI is done on the consecutive mode. And consecutive mode, as you know, has that turn-taking rhythm. A person speaks, interpretation, another person speaks, interpretation, you know the drill, back and forth. Not being able to see the facial cues makes it difficult for the OPI to figure out when they have to chime in to render. But the more skilled and experienced OPI doesn't need the facial cues as much. Another disadvantage is poor acoustics. Most people use a cell phone to call a client or an agency. Depending on where the caller is at, the call can get disconnected, or it could have glitches. There's going to be background noise. If the person places the cell phone on speakerphone, there's echo in the background. Another disadvantage for the interpreter is lack of preparation. No shade on the interpreter, but when the interpreter receives a call, they get the name of the company. If the company name is ABC Company, there's no clue on what that company is about. Is it going to be a medical call, financial, legal? They just don't know. Very different from in-person interpreting, where the interpreter can get that information before the session starts. If you live in a small town where there are no courthouses or big hospitals, or the language that you interpret for is in low demand, over-the-phone interpreting is perfect for you. You can live anywhere in the United States and work remotely from your home. Language agencies are always looking for OPIs. The big agencies are Lionbridge, Cyricom, TransPerfect, and Language Line Solutions. There are other agencies too. Besides your interpreter training, all you need to be a telephone interpreter is high-speed internet, a voice over IP line, USB headsets, a laptop, or a call center or IP phone. You also need a dedicated place to work. It needs to be a quiet place, so no barking dogs, meowing cats, or crying babies. I love children, but you cannot be comforting a child while you're taking calls. Don't be surprised if an agency asks you to take a picture of your workspace. To apply for an OPI job, you will be tested on your legal or medical terminology, and a second test which will involve two people role-playing as a client and a consumer, and you conduct consecutive mode interpreting, or a recording where you listen and interpret. When you get hired, you will receive a contract. Read the contract carefully. I belong to interpreting groups on Facebook, and it blows my mind how many people accept over-the-phone interpreting jobs, don't read the contract, and then they get on Facebook and start posting questions like, have you ever worked for this company? What are they like? How much do they pay? When do you get paid? Why do they do this? Why do they do that? Those were questions that had to be asked during the interview process, not from Facebook groups. Some agencies don't care when you work. You could work in the morning, late at night, on the weekends. It doesn't matter to them. They just want an OPI to be online. But some agencies will require that you work minimum 20 hours a week. Some agencies will require that besides over-the-phone interpreting, you also do video remote interpreting, which is known as VRI. Usually the rate of pay is between 30 and 35 cents per minute for commercial calls. Some agencies have federal government agencies as clients, and they will pay between 40 and 45 cents per minute. Yes, you get paid by the minute. Agencies will usually pay every 30 days. Some agencies will pay every 2 weeks. And agencies that pay every 30 days will allow you to get paid twice a month, but they will charge you 5% of your income. Kind of messed up, huh? Most OPIs are hired as contractors, meaning that they are not employees and they will not get benefits. As a contractor, you're considered self-employed, so you will have to pay for your own taxes, unlike a regular job where taxes are deducted automatically from your income. Paying for your own taxes means that you will be paying for federal, state, city, municipal, and county taxes. And on top of that, you will be paying for Medicare and Social Security. It comes to about 16% of your income. So you'll have to set money aside so that you'll be ready to pay for your taxes every quarter or at the end of the year when you receive a 1099 form from the agency that you work for. You can lower your tax by filing deductions. This is money that you spend to pay for the things that you need to do your job. So save the receipts for internet, devices, pens, pads, maybe even furniture like a good comfy chair. Agencies will direct incoming calls to you one of three ways: through a platform, via your laptop, operator-led system where a live operator calls you and announces the call, or by a dedicated interpreting line. If you get a call through a platform, you're logged into your laptop, you have your USB headset connected, and when the call comes in, a window opens and you're able to see the name of the company and maybe some requirements that company needs in order for you to interpret. You may be able to do other tasks like connecting the client to the consumer. Operator-led calls announces the name of the client and connects the client, you, and the consumer by dialing out. A dedicated interpreting line allows the consumer to go to the client's workplace, pick up a phone that's dedicated for interpreting, select the language that they need, and the call will be connected to the client and the operator. Upon hire, the agency may ask you if there are any calls that you do not wish to take. Let's say that you are a medical interpreter and you don't feel comfortable taking legal calls, so you can let the agency know not to direct legal calls to you. Or maybe you're already interpreting a session and you realize that it's a mental health session where there's a therapist and their patient, and they're talking about something that may have happened to you and is triggering you or making you upset. You have the right to tell the client, "This is the interpreter. I'm not feeling comfortable with this call, or I'm getting triggered because of the subject. Can I please disconnect and get another interpreter?" An OPI has to have a vast vocabulary: insurance, utilities, medical, legal, educational, and even technical terminology in case, for example, you get a call from the local cable service and they're talking about downstream, upstream, live streaming, Wi-Fi. Some agencies specialize in medical, some in legal, some in insurance claims. Make sure that you ask the agency during the interview what kind of calls they take. OPI is great if you're studying for a certification test. The terminology that you learn and the different situations will better prepare you for the test. By the way, if you need terminology practice, check out my audio episodes called Ring of Fire. In it, you'll find terminology practice in the areas of medical, legal, and general for interpreters of all languages, including ASL. If you take medical calls, you'll be required to get a HIPAA certificate so that you can protect and know how to handle patient confidentiality. If the agency has federal government agencies as clients, you will be required to have a security clearance. Federal government agency calls are very long and usually get paid between 40 and 50 cents per minute. Nobody knows all of the words, so during a call, you're more likely to run into the situation where you don't know what the term means or you don't know what the abbreviation means. Because you're working from home, you'll have the convenience of having the laptop and looking up a term on Google Translate or whatever other translation platform you use. But you can always ask or ask for clarification. You can say something like, "This is the interpreter. Would you be so kind to explain that abbreviation?" "This is the interpreter. Would you be so kind to spell out that term?" Sometimes you really need spellings on medications or treatment or procedure names. Sometimes it's not a complicated term. It could be as simple as a street address. The consumer may not be able to pronounce their city or their street address. You will gain more respect from the client and the consumer if you ask. Remember, you have interpreting ethics, where you are called upon to interpret accurately and completely. If you don't understand for whatever reason, or you can't hear, you need to ask. And ask for as many repetitions as you need. I once received a call from Trinidad and Tobago. It was awful. Every 5 minutes there was a beep in the call, and one of the speakers had a very heavy British accent. I lost track of how many repetitions I had to ask for. The important thing is that I was able to interpret accurately and completely despite the barriers. Remember, you're going to be interpreting for the agent's client and the client's client. So customer service is a big plus. You'll be dealing with upset people, angry people, frustrated people, sad people, mean people, all kinds of people. Before you begin your interpreting session, you'll get an opportunity to make an introduction. And if you don't get that opportunity, squeeze it in there anyway. My introductions are, this is the Spanish interpreter. To better serve you, please wait for the interpreter to finish before responding, and please speak only in Spanish. This will let the consumer know what's going to happen, especially helpful if the consumer has never had interpreting services before. You may also take that introduction opportunity to tell them to turn off their speakerphone if you start hearing echoes in the background. If there's noise in the background, you can ask them to move to a quieter place. Sometimes they're outside where there is traffic noise, or calling from their workplace and there are voices in the background, or yes, sometimes they have a crying baby in their arms. Why do I say please speak only in Spanish when I make my introduction? You'd be surprised at the amount of clients and consumers that mix both languages in a statement. I'm not talking about the client speaking in Spanish. I'm talking about the client speaking in both English and Spanish in one statement. Some consumers will tell me that they have very good English and they will just call upon me to interpret when they are unable to figure out how to say a certain word or they need a correction. My answer to that request is always no. I am not an ESL teacher. I'm not a teacher at all. My job is to interpret. If you speak Spanish, I will interpret for you. If you speak English, then you don't need an interpreter and I could serve somebody else. When it comes to the client mixing two languages together, sometimes I feel like the client is actually trying to show off, like, oh, I know some words in Spanish, or I know what they said. But what they're actually doing is making the interpreting session more difficult. Because if the English speaker starts speaking in Spanish, whether it be one or two words, my brain is going to take those Spanish words and turn them into English for a Spanish-speaking consumer. And the consumer is going to be like, what are you doing? My brain is going to be like, what are you doing? And I'm going to be to the client, what are you doing? I'm the interpreter. Everybody has to stay in their own lane. And you are the interpreter, so you have to maintain control of the session. You need to let the client and the consumer know that they need to stay in their own language lane. Same thing goes when the client starts using the third person. When they start saying things like, tell her this, is he that, is he this, tell him that. Yeah, that's not good. In a friendly way, let the client know. Maybe they've never worked with an interpreter before, so they don't know how to address the interpreting session. All you have to do is say, this is the interpreter, and for you to have a better interpreting experience, please speak to the consumer as if they understand English. I will give you a warning and let you know that no matter how friendly you are about this request, some clients get frustrated and upset, and they'll say snarky things like, nobody's asked me that before. Well, maybe not, but I'm the interpreter in this session, and this is how it's going to be. Remember, you have to be in control of the session. I recently had an incident with a doctor. They started speaking English and Spanish, and again, it wasn't full Spanish or full English statements, They were just throwing in words to show off that they knew how to say electrolytes in Spanish. So they told the patient in half English and half Spanish that they needed to consume more electrolytes. I asked the doctor to please repeat the statement so that I can completely interpret to the patient, and they refused. They said that the patient understood what was said. How do they know? Because the patient nodded. Put yourself in the patient's situation. You're speaking to a doctor who speaks another language. They say electrolytes in Spanish, but you don't know what electrolytes are in English or in Spanish. So instead of looking stupid, the patient's like, oh, okay. But with the aid of an interpreter, especially in medical interpreting, where you can be an advocate for the patient, it allows the patient to be a little bit more comfortable and tell the interpreter, what are electrolytes? And then I can interpret to the doctor, what are electrolytes? And then everything will be explained and everybody's happy. But by refusing to repeat the statement so that I could interpret accurately and completely, now that doctor was going into my code of ethics that requires me to do just that, to interpret accurately and completely. It may not sound like good customer service, but I told the doctor that I refused to be in the session. So we had to disconnect the call and they had to get a different interpreter. Remember, you have to be in control of the session. You're not there in person, so it's more difficult when you're interpreting over the phone. Speaking of problems with clients, anytime you have an incident with a client or a consumer, as soon as the call is over, write down what happened. One of the two may file a complaint with your agency, and it may take a couple of months. So when the agency contacts you to find out what happened in a certain call, you'll have the notes to be able to refresh your memory and say what happened. I'm always preaching about self-care. Take breaks. After 30 or 40 minutes of taking calls, log off and take a break. Go to the bathroom, drink water, have a wet snack, go outside and walk around the block. Hang out with your pets, check your email, close your eyes. Whatever you need to do to take a good break, do it. And if you've taken a very long call or a frustrating call, take a break. Besides your voice needing a rest, your brain needs to take a rest. You are doing a very important and a very difficult job. You're listening in one language, interpreting in your head to another language, and speaking in that language to someone else. Not very many people can do that. So consider yourself extremely smart and skillful. When I started interpreting over the phone, I wanted to do an amazing job on day one. I took calls for 6 hours. I took less than 3-minute breaks between calls. Because I didn't rest my voice after 30 or 40 minutes, the next day I could barely speak. My throat was sore. It felt swollen. My face felt swollen. So take care of your voice. Check out my episode on voice care. Besides, when you're tired, thirsty, hungry, or uncomfortable, you're not going to do a good job. Take a break. Every now and then, the agency will add a quality assurance person to your call unbeknownst to you. They have a list of criteria. They will listen to your session and quality check your performance. They'll look for things like requesting clarifications, introductions, the way you treat the client, the way you treat the consumer, syntax, and other criteria. I really enjoy interpreting over the phone. But every now and then, I get that creepy imposter syndrome voice telling me, you're not a real interpreter because you're not in person. You're on the phone. Real interpreters don't interpret over the phone. And then I think to myself, yeah, you're right. I'm not a real interpreter. What am I thinking? That's not true. An interpreter is an interpreter regardless of what platform they're interpreting in. The number one thing interpreters do, as we all know, is help people or more communicate despite the language barrier. Thank you for listening and join me for the next episode of Interpreters and Interrupters.